So this is a joint session between the Canadian Urban Institute and Park People partnering on this. And I know that Park People's been out all week talking about parks. They told me this is their 5th of 7. We're really appreciative of the leadership of Park People across the country to try to make the point and empower communities that parks are ours. You know, the parks aren't somebody else's, they belong to all of us. And how they function in urban life is so crucial, so important to the vitality and the resilience of urban life. And I'm looking forward to hearing my panelists' comments about that, specifically about the challenges that we're working on. You know, green spaces have never been loved like they have been during COVID. Everybody's very aware of that. And at least I think everyone's aware. And what we're also aware of is that there are some parts of cities across the country that don't have access to the green space that they need. And so I think part of the dilemma that we're facing now is the extent to which we don't have equitable access. And so I think it's appropriate that I start off by acknowledging that both CUI and Park People are located in the traditional territories of the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat peoples, and many, many diverse First Nations and Inuit and Métis folks covered by Treaty 13, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and continue to be protected by the Dish with One Spoon wampum agreements. We at CUI have had a reckoning around this over the last several months. We've been called out many, many times for the way in which contemporary city building practices and historical city building practices have disadvantaged and excluded people of color and from Indigenous descent. And how are we going to actually come to terms with that? And I think it's become a really sharp conversation during the COVID period, because affluent neighborhoods have been calling for more access to park space and green space, and neighborhoods that are less resourced haven't been able to have that luxury. So I'm hoping that your gang, you know, this gang here, is going to help us continue to have that conversation about how do we actually change this, make parks more, make them more equitable, more accessible, and much more ubiquitous and commonly used, and not just the purview of neighborhoods that had the benefit of public investment years ago, or who have affluent people living in them who can then supplement what's not there. So I think the equity conversation has a particular resonance when it comes to parks and green spaces. And so I'm going to start by asking folks if they could just give us a sense of where you are. First of all, it's always important for us to hear where you're coming in from. And then particular comments about what you've observed over the last several months, what you think the priorities are, and please don't hold back. I'm going to ask each of you to say something in the outset, and then we're going to have a conversation amongst us. And just remember, on All City Talks and on Park Talks, there's an active chat function here. And if you're en français, qui participe en français, c'est une autre channel for you that you can indicate. And I see that Molly's putting it up in the chat box. So if you'd like to participate in French and listen in French, please do. You'll be able to go to that chat room or that channel. And we encourage you to participate in the chat in a lively way. The panelists may or may not enter into the chat. Sometimes I encourage them not to, because I think it's good for us to have a chat amongst us. But by all means, put questions and comments in the chat, and I'll try to feed them in. And also, you can answer each other in the chat. It's one of the good things about chat. It lives on. And recordings of this broadcast, of course, will be posted on the Park People and on the CUI website. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And then you can watch it again and again and again and pass it to your friends. So let's go to you, Susan, first, if we could. Just give us a context and I love what's behind you. It looks like children's drawings behind you. So I'm looking forward for you talking to us about your particular perspective and what you see as the challenges you've been experiencing, and then we'll open it up. So a couple minutes from you first, Susan.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, it's my understanding this webinar is about return of investment on parks. And so we tend to default to thinking about their revenue generating abilities for their increased property values and the boost to taxes collected, for luring tourists and spending, you know, and those things are all important, but they're also important for their impact to our collective well-being. So I'm from Edmonton, and here we've been doing work on improving urban wellness with the focus on marginalized people, but including other residents and businesses. And our project is called Recover. So we hired a firm called In With Forward to do 4 stints of ethnographic research for us. This means spending time with people that were unhoused or precariously housed, you know, where they're at, riding buses with them, having meals, hanging out in late night haunts, etc. Basically capturing and witnessing what a day in the life looks like. and getting to know what their stressors and pain points are, as well as their motivations and aspirations. And they asked all those street involved folks what was really important to them in terms of living well and being well. And it's really amazing how people with next to nothing really hone in quickly on what's important. And their answers didn't have a lot to do with money or stuff. The top things folks saw their lives needing were purpose, respect, and connection. So this, along with other research, led us to the conclusion that wellness really is a relational phenomenon, that it's really about connections, both within and beyond self. And so a framework for well-being emerged for us, and at its core, it has 6 kinds of connections. Connections to land and ground, to body and self, to friends, family, community, to the sacred, however you might define that, to culture, and to the human project, which is your ability to grow and develop and realize your potential. And our framework also identifies tools for change. And hopefully Lisa or Molly popped it into the chat. Anyways, parks can be spaces that allow us to connect to land and ground, to nature, to the changing seasons, to plants, bees. I heard on Tuesday's webinar about apiaries in park, to feel the sun on your face and hear water burbling, birds chirping. To body and self, possibly places to rest or relax or go to a washroom, if a park is lucky enough to have a public washroom, which, by the way, is a basic sort of infrastructure that is really necessary to the full use and enjoyment of the public realm. Have a nap. By the way, what's the difference between falling asleep on a picnic blanket and someone doing this on a bench or in a tent? Why is one acceptable and the other one require moving on? To family, friends, and community as a place to meet up and visit with people you care about or want to get to know, or as a place to meet unusual suspects, to talk to someone outside your normal social circles and to connect across differences. And to the sacred, for many, nature is sacred. I personally consider myself a member of the Church of the Long Grass and love to marvel at the stars through a tree canopy. And to culture as places for cultural events, whether they be festivals, concerts, picnics, even places to have bread together, grow vegetables. They can be places for reconciliation, and to the human project, right? To go jog, do yoga, hold painting lessons, develop your skills as a gardener. The list is really endless. So parks, I would be remiss if I didn't include the Winter City perspective, having worked on Edmonton's Winter City strategy. They're an important piece of all season infrastructure, and hopefully you design them with the right things in them to support year-round outdoor life. And it's easy to make a park for summer. I encourage you to design for winter first and to check out Edmonton's winter design guidelines. But our focus on them doesn't end with their establishment, their design, and we need to maintain them for winter use, clear them of ice and snow, make them accessible. We need to make them inviting with various kinds of programming, and this will help with getting the full return on investment. But with COVID, as Mary mentioned, they've taken on special importance as people need them as respite from lockdowns. And they are for all people, most especially for those without their own private yards or gardens. And more people have turned to them with their tents and made them their homes. So we know COVID's really underscoring long existing social disparities in our society, and this plays out in our parks. And connection doesn't happen just because you have a park. It isn't simply the provision of that resource, right? It has to do with people's engagement with the world and directly around them with their own kind of curiosity and experience. So how do we promote connection in parks? So I'm going to take you back to Recover and just quickly tell you that with our, we are partnering on a prototype, and it's part of the vast body of work that's addressing inequities, addressing racism, colonial logic. And it's exploring how to support more authentic connections between street-involved people and the rest of the community. It focuses on a connector role related to 24/7 crisis diversion services. And one of their options we're exploring is called the Garden Network Guide. The idea is they would recruit, train, and support owners and managers of natural spaces, and we have a ton of them, to host street-involved adults for informal retreats, to help people connect across differences, to socialize the idea that discomfort and awkwardness can be endured and actually rewarding, and to connect street-involved people to the land, the self, and community. So the hope is that it helps to open up pathways away from repeated crisis and trauma. And I'd be happy to tell you more about that and our other work. I just want to conclude by saying we aren't going just trees and grass or snow mounds, but opportunities for all sorts of connections, and notably connections across differences and for well-being. And we need to activate the power of parks in all seasons and for our collective well-being.
Thanks, Susan. I feel like sometimes in urbanism, we have a problem with vocabulary where a word conveys a certain thing, and you want it to actually mean something different than what it might historically mean. And I think that there's a dilemma with the word park because it suggests it's a definitive thing, and maybe you have access to it and maybe you don't, and maybe it's for you and maybe it isn't. And can I see myself in that place? Do you know what I mean? And park people had an interesting exercise where it asked a bunch of folks around the country to reflect on the meaning of a park and in their life. And I wrote a piece about when I was a kid, I had a park that I got involved with called Deutsch Park, which was called the Pit. And it was really an ugly place, but it was the programming that took place in it. And I would never have thought that I belonged there, except that a neighbor said you should come. And then there was some programming, and I'm interested in terms of the work you've been pursuing on this. We're all trying to channel in Canada our inner Edmontonian as it gets colder. And it's interesting to me that you did the Winter City piece first, and now you're doing is it called the Project Recover project? And these are both about place-based things that you're trying to reimagine to be for everyone somehow, right? I would think there must have been terrific challenge for you because people have an attachment. They think a park is this. They think that street belongs to so-and-so. How did you overcome that? And then I'm going to go to LaMeia because she's in that business, I think, of trying to engage people differently. But I want to just hear from Edmonton, and then I'm going to come to you, LaMeia.
Well, Recover is more than just about place. That's one aspect. But,
right. Sure.
We tend to think of well-being as kind of the responsibility of, an individual or of government or an agency. But we're really shifting away from that to having it be collective responsibility.
Yeah.
And try to encourage that culture shift. Now, remind me of your question.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I was a bit of a ramble. I think I was more talking about how do we move from it just for people thinking a park is the other, as opposed to that it's actually about everything around us. It's about nature around us, I guess, right?
Right. Well, it's about so many things, as I mentioned, right? It's not just green space or white space. It's just so essential for for us to be able to connect together into nature. But
maybe that's the point that you made. I mean, you made that it was about purpose and then it was about connection. I guess that's the piece I'm going to pull from it. LaMeia, can you talk to us about you? I understand you're in Halifax. Susan's in Edmonton. Susan, I don't know if you were aware that while you were listing off whether it's this or whether it's that, somebody poked their head in your room behind you, and I thought you were going to say, and it's about children. I'm assuming it was a child. LaMeia, can you tell us a little bit about? Because I know you're in Halifax. I'm interested in you talking to us about your perspective on the work that you're doing in this. And I just have to warn you that the realities of Zoom is that I can see in my kitchen that there's a pot that's going to boil over. And so I'm going to continue to listen to you, but I'm leaving temporarily, walking 6 feet over to turn the pot down. Go, Mia, I can hear you.
Okay, sounds good. And I just want to, say hello and thanks everyone for coming and being here. And Susan, I really appreciated hearing from you and about the work that you're doing, and look forward to hearing from the other folks that have joined us here today. My business is called LaMeia Connects Consulting. And so I think, I have, through my practice, created a concept called connected leadership, where, I believe that the relationships that we create and work, they can be familial in nature, and just trying to kind of, draw in that humanistic, connection, and where are the connections. And I think the beautiful thing of where I'm at right now, and how I've even come to, identify as an urbanist, and, working within the active transportation space and community engagement that we all know is a part of planning. I've really had to, as the African Nova Scotian Black girl, young person, start to really, hone in on what my body was feeling when I was in nature, And I think that I had the privilege of growing up in a community like North Preston that is surrounded by nature, lakes and trees and forest. And, North Preston, for those of you who don't know, it's one of the Black settlements of African Nova Scotian people, one of the largest and oldest in Canada. Our families and folks and ancestors have been on this land for over 400 years that we can track. And then, prior to that, we were connected with the Mi'kmaq people. And so our ancestry, and we are the land. I think there's something really beautiful about growing up in a place that you feel connected to. And so I think there's something that is so foundational, and like, how do we get people to feel connected to the land? And what I've done and what I've been able to kind of see throughout my work is to just be in my body, but then also, claim space, you know what I mean? And where, there are spaces, we needed a space to gather, as my community, as African Nova Scotian people, Black people, our land and our relationship to each other is all we had at times. So I think there's something really beautiful about using the resilience of my people to now build these spaces that, we really are trying to claim space, and spaces that traditionally we're told aren't for us. And so one of the examples of that is the surfing program that I started with some colleagues from the surf community here and on the Eastern Shore. And, we kind of brought together young people and children to the lakes and to the water, to the ocean to surf. And so, we kind of established programming that allowed for ourselves and for the children to have really transformative experiences with the ocean early, so that we hope to inspire and get them hooked on, that relationship early on. And so I am thinking lots about, what does it look like to be doing work with children and young people and youth, and getting youth and young people to really identify with the spaces that they are in, so that they will grow up to like protect them and want to be there and get outside. And so it's been really exciting, the work that we've been doing in Halifax, Nova Scotia, just around, outdoor programming. And, I was really thrilled to be able to kind of come to this conversation today, because I do know that there's, so much work happening, in Toronto and there's, these big cities, and Halifax is still a little bit small. So we are growing, and there's lots of growth there too. Within COVID, it's been interesting because of the stay home, like, the Atlantic provinces, we were okay with that. We're kind of, we are kind of good with staying home and within our local communities. And so, it's been very interesting to see how, the Atlantic bubble has operated within, a COVID context, because, walkability and access to, a waterfront, or, backyards, and there's lots of access to lots of different places, or they're within driving distance. And so I think, we've seen Halifax really, we have lots of other challenges around, the racially charged stuff that is really coming to kind of, bring us into conflict. But I believe that, the spaces and places to gather will actually help us to work through some of those conflicts. And so I guess I'm very hopeful in the work that I'm doing as an activist, or, call me what you want, but, like, I think there's this real intention that I have to really use the public spaces and to use nature and to use, reclaiming space and, Africville, the taking away of a community of people to build, for, the commercial purposes. Like, we're still really grappling with those deep histories and traumas here, as we are all over Canada. But I think that, we can have those conversations while we are at parks, when we name, or we create a new public installation to name, the history of African Nova Scotian people. We can gather there, then talk about that history, and then imagine where we might go together in the future. And so, there's something about this relational aspect that I'm really looking forward to as we start to name it. It's a new conversation that I feel is really timely, and I'm all here for it. And so I'm really thankful to be here today and to hear and to exchange these ideas.
It's interesting to do when we do a land acknowledgement on these sessions, and then we realize that this is actually a topic that's is really about the land, and and our parks, in fact, were they seen as a vehicle historically to do that? When the famous landscape architects were designing the very famous parks in the world, in France and in Paris and in New York, were they thinking about that? But you're, LaMeia, in the middle of another form of a crisis around land rights and natural rights in Nova Scotia right now,
Yeah.
with a fishery. And I'm interested what your perspective is now as you're living through that conflict that has pre-existed COVID, but now it's just manifesting like crazy.
Yeah.
Do you have a perspective on that? Because it's right on your doorstep.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been terrifying. It's been actually horrific to see what is happening. The conflict in Digby, and I think for me, it's like I am a Black person and African Nova Scotian, but I have Indigenous and Mi'kmaq lineage as well that I'm learning about. And so I think the thing is that we're so connected in more ways than we thought. And so I have seen this really beautiful way that we're coming together, and for folks to say, this is not us, but then for some people to say, well, like there's this real, like, the tension is really high. And I think, when we see, certain people be able to get away with certain things like burning down people's establishments, it's scary. And so I think that the bravery that I'm seeing amongst, people here now to have these conversations is where it starts. The claim to the land, and the inspiration that we can draw from Indigenous peoples. It's like, it's talk to the people on the ground. You know what I mean? I think there's lots of rhetoric around reconciliation and stuff within the university and the academic space. But I'm loving talking to grandmothers and grandfathers and listening to children actually, because I think that we have to actually get way more grassroots. And then we have to actually really tap into that humanistic part of like, there's enough resources here for everybody. I love the language around the moderate livelihood, because, Indigenous peoples, we're all about not taking more than you need. And so I think that there's something that, we can all learn from what the conflict that's happening in Digby right now to really say, like these treaties, we are all treaty people, and for everyone to have to grapple with that. What does it mean for you to be a treaty person? And no one gets to really be exempt from that conversation now. And so I think we're all trying to find our way towards how we want to live together. And my hope is that we will find that being together is way better than being apart.
I mean, as you say, it's about attachment. You form an attachment to place and the resources that come with that place. And Indigenous people have a profound attachment to that place and to the resources that are available to them.
And they don't feel ownership over that. That's the thing that's really important. And I think that's what people have to understand is that, we do not say we own. And so, sometimes it's hard because how can you own the earth? And so we are in relationship with the generosity of the earth. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's a little bit of like, we have to work on that, more and more. And as, Indigenous people or like, Black people, African people try to get back to what we know foundationally, that we've been lost through decolonization and all that kind of stuff, we have to like unpack that, even for ourselves, you know what I mean? And then what is our right? Like we have a right to be able to live in sovereignty and to govern ourselves. And so we, as a Black person, to be liberated in my body and not feel that I'm going to be, it's funny, I'll tell a story quickly, but like, depending on where I'm at, like people, like as a Black person navigating through Halifax, it's like, why are you at this community garden when you should be at the Hope Blooms garden where the Black people are? But when I live my street on Pleasant Street, it's like, oh, all of a sudden, like, are you there to steal the vegetables? No, I actually live in this neighborhood. So I think there's this negotiation that we constantly have, no matter where my body is and place and space, I'm always like conscious of whether I should be there or not. And so how do we not have that happen? And we take up space and we basically design, parks and things around historical things. And we actually make the first peoples and people who've been here really feel welcomed in that way. I think that's how that's a solution to the problems we face in that way.
I mean, maybe maybe the negotiation around access to place is actually fundamental to urban life. When you think we made this decision at some point that we were going to settle together, and now we have to kind of navigate that. I guess Indigenous people would say they weren't given a choice. We just arrived and settled and there you go. But now that we're in the mess that we're in, is there a different way to navigate this? I lived in New Orleans after Katrina for 5 years. I don't know if anybody else here has been to New Orleans, but the Built Forum, I'm going to come to you now, Robin, because the Built Forum in New Orleans, they have on many of the boulevards, they have this middle strip along the avenues, so there's traffic on one side going one way and there's traffic on the other side going the other way. And then in the middle, there's what I think I would have called a boulevard. But so it's a green space, people walk their dog in it and stuff like that. But in New Orleans, it's called the neutral ground. And it's historic from because New Orleans had free men of color, African Americans, Cajun, white settlers, all there, that big gumbo that makes up New Orleans, and they would, Mardi Gras Indians, they would meet on the neutral ground. And so that term has stuck. And it's interesting to me if we ever would imagine parks being fundamentally neutral grounds. I don't know. Robin, what do you think? I know that you're in the business of applying all sorts of sophisticated analysis to how the spatial city affects us. I guess how we affect it and how it affects us. And part of what I was hearing LaMeia say is that we have to get to a place where we're going to co-design these places and spaces if we can. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about your practice and your observation? And where are you today? Are you still in Kitchener-Waterloo, or where are you now?
No, I moved back home to Victoria. I grew up here, which is also the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, and I'm just very grateful to be here, especially at a time like you just spoke about, with the tensions in our country around indigenous relations and claim to space. It's interesting to me. I mean, I have, Mary, how long do I have?
Don't worry, if you go too long, I'll intervene. Just have at it,
just
man.
like yell at me. Okay, it's hard, especially with these online panels. But yeah, so I'm in Victoria right now, but I'm the son of an immigrant and a refugee. I'm a settler. My dad had to live in a jungle while he was escaping a genocide. So our family's relationship to green space is complicated, and I think that's something that, as a neuroscientist, so for people who may not be aware, I'm an environmental neuroscientist. That term just came out last year because it's such an emerging field. But basically, I use neuroscience to understand how people experience their social and physical environments, what happens to your brain and your body. And that's what I love so much about what LaMeia was talking about, focus on the body. Because, the work that I do really is trying to capture the intuitive experience that we already know that we're having, just so people who hold the purse strings, we can say, hey, look, there's some data here. And so what's interesting to me about green space and the impact on the body is that the dominant theories of why green space, dominant psychological theories of why green space is considered to be restorative, implicates, there's two kind of main theories. One's stress restoration theory that was proposed by Roger Ulrich. The idea is once you get into green space, there's elements about that environment that allow you to relax. And then there's attention restoration theory, which is proposed by the Kaplans, which is when you get to green space, your attention that is fatigued during your day-to-day experiences in the city can be restored. And what's fascinating to me as a non-Black, non-Indigenous person of color is that I've had some really terrible experiences in green spaces. And from a neuroscientific perspective, those memories, those emotional memories are embedded in your brain. And it informs how you experience the world. It informs the vigilance with which you live your life. And we're living in a time that's dominated by just everyone's vigilant. You're worried about getting an illness. You're worried about transmitting that illness to people you love and care about. You're worried about transmitting that to people you don't even know, because we live in a collective. We're part of a collective as much as we want to believe that we're individualists. So I think it's really interesting. I've learned so much about myself. We've had a lot to think about, and we've had a lot of time to think about it. And I've been, I guess, pushed to examine my own experiences of marginalization, but also my own privilege. And that lens I'm trying to use in my research to examine what it is like. Not everybody experiences green space the same. They think there's this push to say build a park here, and that's going to solve the problem. And there's just so many other complexities to that. There's the quality of the park. There's been research that shows that parks in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in the United States are terrible. And when you look at the environmental psychological literature on that, park quality and biodiversity of foliage and all the other elements that come with a healthy ecosystem aren't as present in these spaces. And so those spaces themselves can't be restorative. But even if we do create these perfect parks, at the end of the day, there's still disparities in the experience that people have. There's a lineage of Black thinkers, W.B. Du Bois, and late 1800s Black sociologist talked about the notion of double consciousness. And I was reading his work and I was like, this is brilliant. This is cognitive neuroscience, like 100 years ago. And
Before we called it that.
Sorry?
Before we called it that.
Before we called it that. It was just an observation on the challenges that he, as a Black man in an extremely racist society, not that much has changed, the burden that he took on his consciousness, the effort that it takes to be constantly vigilant. And what's interesting is in the 90s and 2000s, there was, he's actually passed away, I found out last week. I went to write him an email to ask him about his work. Dr. Rodney Clark, a Black psychologist, I found a memorial page for him, which really saddened me, but he did some work on racism related vigilance. And he's like, the physiological consequences of being a marginalized person, particularly a Black person in today's society, comes with impacts on our physiology. Like, there's higher arterial elasticity, your baseline heart rate's up, you're sweating more, and all these like really subtle things that we may not even pick up on in this society where we're already so hyper aroused as cities are chaotic spaces. If someone's anticipating racism and they're in a green space, then it doesn't matter. Like, we have to think about this in two ways. We have to build good quality spaces. We have to make them accessible, but we also have to work at the same time on addressing a lot of the injustices that the Black Lives Matter movement has really brought to air. And they've been talking about it forever. And I'm actually happy that these things have combined between the pandemic and the protests, because it's not just about space, it's about how it's experienced. And so I think hopefully in today's conversation, we can, I can use my lens as a psychologist or my experience as a person of color to add to the complexity of this conversation and really try to give voice to people who've been historically and systematically excluded from these conversations. And I just want to shout out, like, I told LaMeia this before the panel we were talking about, but I just love like the Blacks or the surfing initiative, because, on a whole, outdoor, adventure is like extremely white. My dad has a fishing boat. He's a biologist. And every time that we go fishing, like, we're the only people of color there and everyone's staring at us, and it's terrifying. Yeah. You're out on the water, right? I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen out here? So anyways, there's a lot to say about green space and outdoors, but look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Robin. One of the questions we're getting in the chat is, are we talking about green space? Are we talking about biodiversity corridors? Are we talking about parks? Are we talking about nature in the city? So I'm going to go to you, Caroline, if I could, just about the work that you do in Montreal and generally Park People's approach, because I appreciate Park People is in your name, but at the same time, I think part of what I'm hearing from all of you is that there's a park sensibility that we can bring to the city that isn't necessarily only in a park, maybe, if you know what I mean. Just what Robin was just suggesting about, Black Lives Matter was expressed on streets. It was expressed in public space. And if we lose those public spaces, we lose the opportunity to celebrate, protest, own the city. I guess that's the point. And parks are part of that system, the civic common system. So Caroline, can you talk a little bit about the work you do in Montreal and generally how Park People's approaching this idea of owning and entitlement? I don't mean owning in the way that LaMeia caught me on. It's not that you own it, but that you have, what's the right way to say it, LaMeia? You have access to it?
Yeah, or in relationship with.
You're in relationship with it.
Yeah.
Right. And then when we come out of that, I want to talk about how do we start to co-develop these things, and we will get to the idea of how do we get a return on investment. It's such a monetary question. I'm always allergic to it, but I know we have to think about it. We do have to think about it. Okay, Caroline, go.
Well, hi. I'm not that fluent in English as you all are, so I already apologize for my. It's kind of a challenge for me to synthesize the multiple hat I'm wearing today. So I am the responsible of development in Quebec province. So not only focusing on Montreal, and I have some maybe interesting. Aspects to share about a project we're doing in Gatineau, but we'll see if we'll have time for that. But it's a project linked to a flood several time flooded area in Gatineau that had so many hundreds of houses have hundreds of families have lost their homes, and now these sites are becoming public. But I will not focus on that, but just wanted to say that I'm not only Montreal focused, and I'm part of the national research team that we have worked on the Canadian City Park report that have been launched for the second year in this summer. And so I think for a couple of next minutes, I just want to share some relevant stats that we've gathered through this report, and also the survey we did on COVID and the impact of COVID on parks and parks community. Because a couple of those stats are really linked to what the previous panelists have shared. So first of all, I just wanted to reiterate that parks have been more than ever essential services, and we have asked municipalities and citizens all around Canada their opinion on that. And some of the key stats that had been identified are the fact that 94% of cities reported increased appreciation for parks values to public health from municipal leadership. And so there is definitely a really, really strong link between public health and parks. Just over half of cities reported park use as increased since the pandemic began, and 2/3 of Canadians reported visiting a park several times a week. So the idea of like connecting during this pandemic more than ever on a weekly basis with parks is really important. And so the sorry, I'm searching my word, but the fact that it's on a regular basis means that it needs in a way to be close to your home, and it leads to this whole territorial equity of park availability. And some neighborhoods in big cities definitely have less park access than others. So there is a whole impact on the public health, where some areas suffer from less parks areas. So for us and for me, being a landscape architect, I am definitely not coming from the social or psychological background, but for me, I'm always thinking on the land and physical perspective. So the proportion is really not help the disproportion and the inequity territorially in the big municipal areas definitely have influence. So and other key stats. So we did, as I was saying, a Canadian survey. So in this survey, over 80% have said parks are more important to their mental health. So it's quite a big number. So the link is really, really strong. Nearly 2/3 said parks have become more important for their sense of connection to nature during COVID-19. So really this connection that we've already talked about is so strong. 70% of cities reported increasing demand for park naturalization project, and 56% of cities reported increasing the demand for natural stewardship and programming. So this connection can be, so it's not just a question of providing green spaces, but how do you activate the connection with it through programming is really, really important. And especially when we're thinking of the challenges the cities are now facing with the budget limits, that is definitely huge. So 2/3 of cities said they expect COVID-19 to negatively impact budgets in the next year. This comes to the heels of insufficient budgets being listed as the top challenge by Canadian City in the report 2 years running. So it's not a surprise, but 50% of cities that have been surveyed the previous months said they had an already reduced staffing level for park maintenance operation during COVID especially. And in Montreal, I can say that we've seen it. So in Montreal, we have a mayor of mobility. That is the priority of our mayor, and it's amazing. She's doing a great work. We have a lot of improvement on that side, but it comes also with a challenge regarding parks. So during COVID, what happened is that the city priority was to open public space and activate the street, and that can lead to the question of what is a park, the definition of a park, but so we have parks in Montreal and we have streets in Montreal, and we see the difference, but the benefits from parks regarding streets are not the same. We can see similarities, but park and street access doesn't necessarily lead to the same benefits, especially when we're talking about the benefits from connection with nature, where there is definitely less in streets. But that said, so the big move in Montreal during COVID regarding the public accessibility, citizen accessibility to public space, was that the mayor launched a big project of a network of more than 100 kilometers of safe and active lanes. And so these lanes have been implemented roughly and in urgent mode to reopen some space, some streets for pedestrian active transport, terraces, and social economy in a way, small local businesses. But all the staff resources that was supposed to normally do maintenance for parks have been moved to the streets maintenance. And so we've seen some challenges in the quality of the parks, where they were so and more than ever used and busy, full of people, but less maintenance resources. So many things a big dilemma. And I want to say that I think for cities and city decision makers, the city elected officials, it's probably such a big challenge to have that responsibility of prioritize. And one of the things us park people, we really want to give them some arguments to see how parks are key in the solutions. And I think the public health arguments are really, really important. And so I have so many other stats to say, but I don't want to take too much time because
your colleague has put a link to the report in the chat. So
yeah, so
look it up and see all the data there. But you've given us a really good segue, Caroline, to the topic that we need to spend the next 20 minutes on, which is how do we secure the financial future of these places? You know, when city budgets, municipal governments have had extraordinary demands placed on them through COVID. They've had to cover all sorts of costs that they didn't anticipate, and they already were facing all sorts of budget challenges. Susan will know this from her time in the city. So I'm interested what the four of you would say about how do we argue for the return on investment that these places provide, and how do we feel about the financial arrangement that exists now, where parks are predominantly funded by out of municipal government budgets, which come from the property tax and then the occasional investment from another level of government? Susan, I'm going to start with you and just talk about that, about how do we, you know, when city budgets, I mean, you're all in them now. Every municipality across the country is now trying to set their budget for 2021. And I can tell you that they're all looking at deficits because they've had to, because their transit system isn't operating and their user fees aren't functioning. So I think we're in for a tough tumble here in terms of, Caroline was just saying that the maintenance isn't being done. And I guess it raises the big bad question, are we amenable to private money starting to come into park maintenance and park investment? And what are your anxieties about that, which I suspect there are some. So Susan, I'm going to go to you first and then back to you, LaMeia, and then over to you, Robin. Go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I can unmute myself. Okay. I don't have the answer there. You're asking really tough questions, and you know, municipalities are between a rock and a hard place. I know they've already cut back park maintenance budgets since the spring, I guess, or April or something like that. And you know what's interesting is because these spaces are so well loved by people, residents have stepped up to do some of the maintenance.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? I mean, I want to know whether, you know, whether volunteers, and I've always heard from advocates that they worry that's the thin edge of the wedge, that unions will then start to object and no, you're taking my job. And how do we hold that balance between something that needs to be publicly accessible and fair and equitable? At the same time, LaMeia, you're in the business of getting people to get engaged in doing stuff, right? So LaMeia, what do you think? how are we going to secure the the sustainable future of these places?
I mean, I think it really, like, we have to really bring the conversations together. And so municipalities and governments and people need to get better at doing community engagement and consultation.
Together.
And so I don't know whether or not I think that, they're doing their best at that. I know that so I do think that there needs to be money and stuff reallocated to facilitators and people who are on the ground who can then, take the grassroots and the community.
So they can enable the connection.
And then move it up and almost
Yeah.
get the community to tell, the governments what they want. And so I think that, with community gardens, for example, people really work together to steward those spaces. And I think there needs to also be some investment in some, giving the land back to people. So I know, for example, like, there's an Africville protest happening, like, this coming Saturday, and that people are really saying that they want Africville back. And so I think there's this really interesting thing of, what might it look like for the province to give it back, to the people? Like, could there be structures in place that, allow for communities to take care? I'm sure they will do a marvelous job at stewarding those lands. And so I think that the province and has, and the feds and Canada needs to let go of all of the things that they've kind of kept in their possession and turn housing back to people with collective models and cooperatives.
So land trusts.
Yeah, land trusts, like stuff like that. I want to see more of those models.
I'm wondering too if we have to kind of not only have one model in our head.
Mhm.
Like, can we have a bunch of models in our head? Because
Yeah,
my apartment is near a social housing project, a social housing community. I think it might be a religious housing community. I'm not sure. I don't know, actually. No, I think it might be religious. The sort of providers of the housing, and they have a community allotment garden, and it's in a parking lot.
Yeah.
And I don't think, and it's not publicly owned. It would be owned by the charity, I guess. So
there's lots of bylaws and stuff too that really hinder. So we need
lift
people
those, maybe?
to look at reshaping those. We need, like, municipal people to, like, get, in there. And so I'm really hoping that, through the election that we've seen recently, we just voted in all of our, new municipality or our new councillors, and that, the councillors are really going to be willing to be on the ground with community to hear from them. We do have, like, the Ecology Action Center and people who are really starting to kind of take on these conversations. So I do believe that there needs to be some visionary leading. There needs to be some loud voices, and there needs to be some willingness to listen as well. And I think that we can really work through some of these deficits, and then people will, the money invested in, healthcare here will be really preventative. And so we'll see a movement. I hope. That's what I can see anyways. I don't know.
I mean, what about a park bond? I mean, the dilemma we're going to have, though, is that lower income neighborhoods don't have the resources for this. But as you suggest, governments might own land in those lower income neighborhoods that they could then release, or parking lots, or there's this whole discussion about parking areas around public housing that often they don't need as many spots as are there, and they just sit there kind of empty. Robin, have you done thinking on this about how do you make the case? I mean, you're in the business of arguing that the spatial configuration of cities affects how we perform as people. Have you done some thinking about how else we could cost this or finance it?
Yeah, I mean, I really liked LaMeia's point about the importance of looking at this as like a preventative healthcare issue. That's
so you want to shift some money, eh? You want to take, and I'm wondering, is that possible, Susan? I mean, what Robin's suggesting, can we take it out of public health and get it front and loaded into parks?
You're talking about different jurisdictions, right? Provincial versus municipal.
Yeah.
We gotta.
Yeah, although it varies, eh? It varies. Public health is also in local governments in some parts of the country, but yeah. How do you front and load it? Robin, go ahead. And then LaMeia.
LaMeia, go ahead.
Well, just saying some alignment between those, you know what I mean? Like Department of Justice, Department of Health, Department of Education. Like, I work as a consultant for a lot of different agencies, and what I want to see is more integrated, approaches, more collaboration. We know the problems, poverty. So I think that we're starting to get at it with some of the, poverty reduction strategies. And, we're starting to get at it when we can start to find shared language. And so there needs to be some more work around, building capacity around creating that shared language. And so we might need to bring in a doctor who has that expertise, from, like, how do we kind of like look across the nation? Don't need to kind of be siloed even and use best practices across. I think that's because Canada, really, we have the similar problem everywhere. So I think we need to do what we're doing here today. You know what I mean? Like keep having the conversations and follow up after as well.
Yeah, and I wonder if, we've got some good people on the chat. I see Catherine Soplat here from Brampton. We need to think about, are there other mechanisms to actually harvest some resources? So, because parks, of course, are about carbon sequestration. They've got all these other things. Robin, you were in mid-sentence. Do you want to keep going?
Yeah, I forgot what I was talking about.
Paying for it. Other ways to pay for it or make the case.
Pay for it. Yeah, so, one thing that, so the reason I went back to do my PhD is because I was working as a mental health occupational therapist for 5 years. And so I was working clinically in communities, and I was seeing what was happening to people as a product of bad urban design. And my frustration with that system was what led me to leave. I couldn't do it anymore because I saw this. There was a highly taxed system. Our push was to. The second we got occupational therapists referred to them as clients, doctors referred to them as patients, but people that were helping, the main thing was get them discharged as quickly as you can, get them off your caseload, and I was working with really vulnerable people with mental health issues, experiencing all sorts of marginalization from every aspect you can think of. But the most detrimental thing that regardless of whatever their diagnosis was, or in addition to the most detrimental pervasive issue with loneliness and the absence of connection. And we can't, it's an issue of human rights. People are entitled to connecting with other people. And so when I think about this from a funding perspective, I know I'm kind of weary about using, about using Scandinavia as an example because it's a very homogenous society. It doesn't have similar pressures to what we have in Canada, being a settler nation and a melting pot. But my understanding, I think it was in Finland, the ministries collaborate. So climate change, Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Infrastructure, they have a meeting.
Yeah, there's a collaborative process. I think Caroline wants to jump in here. She's going to give us an example, and I think Gatineau is this interesting pilot. I think we need to have some more examples that are surfacing. Caroline, what can you add in there?
Well, I'm not sure if Robin was done.
No, go ahead.
But I've got my eye on the clock, so I've got.
I'm just saying yes to all of what you're saying. One thing I wanted to say, so maybe I don't know if I will jump on Gatineau specific project, but I think one of the solution is really connected to the redefinition of parks. And so I think park should not be seen as only equipment, but more than that, living thing. And I really like what Jill Penaloza was saying. So it's parks are so important, and we should see them as living things, and look at all the layers of benefits that are so more than only environmental, and so by defining differently parks, we can start a more collaborative and open conversation and invest diverse money in it. And we see it through our reports, our research, that that parks are now managed by so many different hats, but maybe it is still in all around the country too much seen as an equipment, and it should be seen really differently as a living thing, and iteratively also to absorb all the different pilot approaches. I have so many other things to say, but one last thing I wanted to say about the money, because I really care about finding ideas and solutions for municipal staff and decision makers. One thing I think is that to not to see delegation of power and the diversification of the stakeholders of parks managing is really key. So to find ways to more to continue and improve the collaboration with third parties or nonprofit or organizations that can be, and I know you talked about unions and the legal challenges sometimes, but by showcasing more and more and more the quick wins of these kind of relations and collaborations are so key, because we can all share the money charge by delegating more. And we have so many, we're doing a lot of study case on that with Park people. So
Robin, I'm going to come to you and then ask each person for just a very quick sort of sum up of what you think. I'm hearing some questions around new models, and I hope somebody on the chat is smart, thinking about social impact bonds maybe for parks, all the different ways that we can get different kinds of investors into this. I'm seeing suggestions from Doug Bennett saying, what about other folks? How do we make the case that businesses and neighbors and all the sort of combined forces that could conceivably create resources? Surely during COVID, it's been really shown to everybody how critical it is if you have a park and how critical it is if you don't have a park. Robin, go ahead. What were you going to say? And then I'm going to go around for every last comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just really want to bring up something quick. We've discussed the notion of environmental stewardship and the importance that green space has for that. So I'm really hesitant to use a fiscal lens on what I consider to be a fundamental human right, which is access to nature. But if we invest in parks now and we make good parks, and young children can go experience good quality parks, when they're older and they're voting or they're running for mayor, they're going to understand the value of this. And there's research that suggests that positive experiences in nature at a young age leads to generally a higher level of environmental stewardship, which is extremely necessary, not just for green space in our cities, but for climate change, which was a thing that we're talking about for this pandemic.
It makes us better citizens, presumably. We're more aware of connection. Susan, what would your last comment be? Unmute yourself there, Sue.
I don't know. There's so many things that I really like LaMeia's point about common language and getting people on the same page. I think those are really important things. And loneliness is a pandemic. I think our modern culture doesn't support connections the way we need them, and we need to just work more at this. This is important.
Okay, LaMeia.
I was just thinking, that I didn't even mention, the opportunity to grow food. What better investment than food production? You know what I mean? Once we are able to sustain ourselves, nourishment, and so I think that community gardens, parks, growing food is one of those real tangible ways that we can kind of negotiate this fiscal but supplementary reason to have nourishing food. And how empowering it is. And I think it brings me full circle back to the conversation about the Indigenous, communities in terms of 7 generations. So everything that Indigenous people do is basically thinking about 7 generations ahead. And so, I think traditionally we've lost a lot of that knowledge through colonization. And I think we really need to kind of really keep the decolonized conversations very high on our profile as we start to, or our list as we start to move forward with these conversations, because I think a lot of the answers are there. Let's do what we used to do. And there's a little bit of a return back to discovering what was that. I don't have my grandma here to tell me, what she did when she was farming North Preston anymore. Mm-hmm. But I still feel really like it's really important for me to remember that memory and to actually return Preston back to the land it used to be, and to protect it with everything that I have in me. As we start to think about the future generations, right? I don't want it to just be a park where no residents are there and living. So we do have to really keep an eye on those communities that are really vulnerable towards losing their culture, for the purpose of expansion or growth. So yeah, I'm just really, I really appreciate the conversation today. And my word is to kind of, let's just keep digging deeper to understand different perspectives.
Well, and I want to match what you just said with what Robin said, because we want to reconnect with how we used to attach ourselves to places, but at the same time, he's saying, but it's a right for everyone. So we can't just create clubs for people that are like us. It has to be both. We've got to have some kind of somebody talked about, I think you talked about attention, which I heard as tension, but Robin, but this idea that we've got to hold both. There have to be some rules and some expectation about a right, and we have to encourage the grassroots to engage. Last comment to you, Caroline, and then we're going to wrap up.
Oh my God, it's so hard to have a
30 seconds in not in your mother tongue. 30 seconds.
Oh my God. No, I'm so happy we can open this conversation. I really think that defining parks and open the definition is a key. Being a landscape architect coming from this really practical discipline, I think I see more than ever the importance of opening the definition. And I just want to finish with a small Montreal example connecting with what you just said, LaMeia. Is that our botanical garden this year decided to, for COVID, decided to stop maintaining the roses area, that it was kind of an important proportion of the site to do to do urban agriculture and to share that for a food bank. So it's just an example of an institutional, really important park in Montreal that was focusing on botanical knowledge, which is amazing, but it wasn't an urgent need. So they shift this area for producing food. So I think this is just a small, really great example that had shined through all the city. And I see those little steps really important and influencers of the next good things to do.
Little steps are important. I want to thank everybody for coming on. You know, one of the key points about resilience is that you never do one thing. You never do an intervention that only provides one benefit. You always have to be multi-solving. And I think that parks are about multi-solving, multi-investing, all the various returns on an investment. And we're just trying to figure out how we actually map that to convince decision makers why they should prioritize that. Park people is called park people for a reason, because people in parks go together. People in parks are inseparable. And that's what this whole conversation in this series is about. We want to thank the Metcalf Foundation and the TD Reddick Commitment for supporting park people's work here. CUI is always very privileged to partner with park people. So we appreciate you coming on and being part of this. This video will be posted. And remember, the conversation doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning to make the case about what an extraordinary return on investment we get from our connection to place and to people through parks. Susan, thanks. LaMeia, great to meet you. Caroline, lovely to meet you. And Robin, nice to see you again. And thanks, park people, for inviting CUI to be part of this. We're really happy to do it, and we hope you have a good rest of the week. Go out and enjoy a park. And if you have a park you can contribute to and engage with, we hope you will.